After a week when Toronto's Jewish high school chat had to be evacuated because of a bomb threat, after a week when the windows and doors of our local Starbucks just 2 blocks away from here was targeted with hateful slogans and slander, we need to know where to look for courage now. And we wonder, what are the models of strength for us now? Since October 7th, I have been thinking a lot about my grandparents' generation. And I spoke of my grandfather last Shabbat when it was Remembrance Day. I take courage from the generation of Holy Blossom Temple leadership who built this synagogue in 1938, when anti-Semitism was raging in the city, when none is too many was the Jewish immigration policy. When the Depression was fierce, our congregation decided it was time to move uptown and to build a great sanctuary that would hold 4 times its membership then, because they believed that Jewish life would thrive here in Toronto. And they designed hand-carved, heavy oak doors to keep the people inside safe. And they set in the design on the exterior facade of this great edifice, they set on guard above the doors 2 proud lions of Judah. And above the ark to guard the Torah scrolls, another 2 lions of Judah. Last Sunday, I gathered with many of you at Christie Pitt's, home to the worst of the anti-Semitic outbreak, the worst in Canadian history. In 1933, you recall, a swastika flag was flown at a baseball game, and that sparked 10,000 rioters and spectators to rage against one another for 6 hours while the police did nothing. But last Sunday, it seemed that history was corrected. Between 4,000 and 5,000 gathered at that very spot to rally for Israel, to rally for the hostages, to rally against anti-Semitism, and all was peaceful and quiet. The police were there to keep the peace and to keep us safe. There was, to my eyes, not one counter-protester to be seen. There was only a sea of blue and white flags with the Star of David. And although that baseball diamond remains and some of those older trees that witnessed the riot in 1933, thank God so much has changed and history has been made right. Last Tuesday, I gathered with nearly 300,000 people in Washington, D.C. for another rally, the largest rally of Jews in North American history. When I stood there last in 1987 with 250,000 people at the March for Soviet Jewry, I was 16 years old. And that was a moment then that really would shape the person I would become. I was then the social action vice president of my local youth group in suburban Boston, and it was my responsibility to arrange for a bus and to recruit a bunch of teenagers to drive through a blizzard to get to Washington to make some noise for the refuseniks, our Jewish brothers and sisters who had been silenced in Soviet prison cells. That rally, that crowd, that collection of Am Yisrael made such an impression on me. And on this past Sunday, those memories came flooding back for me and for many others. There is power in numbers, and it felt good to be counted, but not exactly so necessary, because the crowd was so large. I felt so safe just being one of so many, part of the herd that was gathered. It felt good to show up, it felt right to be counted among my people, but it also felt very easy and simple and safe because of the enormity of the crowd. There are times in Jewish history when we need the strength of the lions of Judah. We see that strength now in the IDF soldiers who stand on guard at this very hour. Their eyes are alert, their bodies are poised to spring into action. Thank God for them. May God watch over and protect them as they protect the citizens and residents of Israel. May God give them the power of discernment to know when to advance and when to hold back. But the truth is that for most of our history, we do not travel like a pack of lions. We travel in herds. We are less often like the unit of soldiers and more often like the slow march of last week's rallies. The animal most often associated with the Jewish people throughout the millennia is not the lion, but the goat. So I want to talk a little bit about that. And when we take up the role of the lion, and when we take up the role of the goat. When we went down to Egypt as shepherds and goat herders, we were discriminated against because of it. There it is written, they happened to be herdsmen. They happened to be breeders of livestock, and they brought with them their flocks and herds and all that was theirs. And Joseph makes a big deal out of this occupation, so much so that he instructs his brothers who have come from famine-stricken Canaan, saying, when Pharaoh summons you and asks you, what is your occupation? Leave out the part about the goats. Why? The text tells us, the Torah explains, that goat herders are despised by the Egyptians. It seems that the root of the very first discrimination, the very first othering against our ancestors was wrapped up in our association with goats. But nevertheless, we never assimilated away from goats. After 400 years or so of slavery, when so much of our identity was lost in Egypt, we left with our goat-loving identity intact. As it is written, a mixed multitude went up with them, and very much livestock, both flocks and herds. So it seems that the stubborn, stiff-necked trait of the Israelites includes standing with the goats and moving in herd-like gatherings. Another example that you know well, Chad Gadya. When we gather around our Seder tables, we sing the rousing chorus, an allegory for Jewish history. The young goat my father bought for, that little goat represents the Jewish people. And each of the animals and the forces that follow, the cat, the dog, the stick, and so on, each one represents another kingdom, another empire, which over the millennia rose up to destroy us. Greece, Rome, Spain, and so on. That little goat has to navigate his way through a nursery rhyme of terror again and again and again. But the final verse, what comes to overtake the Malach HaMavet? Who will win out over the angel of death in the end? HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Holy One, blessed be God, will overtake death itself. God will bring the death of death. God will provide a time and place where death is rendered powerless and where everywhere is the blessing of peace. That time is somewhere on the horizon. When it will come, God only knows. But until then, that little goat has to hang on, navigating the narrow paths, navigating the open spaces of this sometimes dangerous world. And we do it much better when we travel together. Where else do we come across the power of the goat? In today's Torah portion. Bereshit chapter 27, when Isaac is old and preparing a blessing for his son, You remember the scene. It's a story of life and death in the balance. It's a story of blessing and curse in the balance. And when Rebecca takes up her lioness moment, she instructs Jacob, saying, "Listen to my voice and do just as I say. I command you. Go now to the flock and fetch for me 2 goats, and I will make them into a savory dish for your father, such as he loves, and you will bring them to him, so that he might eat and give you his blessing before his death." And you recall, we read it, Jacob, whose name will one day be Israel, is literally dressed up like a goat. Rebecca covers his hands and the hairless part of his neck with the skins of the goat. It's such a funny little detail that the Torah provides. And it's debated, of course, whether or not Isaac, who was blind with age, really fell for it or not. But either way, Jacob is designated as the goat through which blessings will come to his descendants. The blessing brought through the goat is preemptive. It comes lifnei mato, before the death of Isaac. And the blessing comes before Jacob is launched as a patriarch of Israel, before he sets out on a coming-of-age story of his own. So there is this strange relationship. The goat is a tender young hero who is never alone. This is the one who goes far and deep into the never-ending story of our people. Lila, Beckett, and Asher, and Kayleen, who's celebrating upstairs, are beautiful B'nai Mitzvah. How do you take your place among your people today? By reading and blessing a Torah scroll made of goat parchment. That's how. You insert yourself into the history of the Jewish people. You make of yourself a link in the chain of the Shalshelet Hadorot, the chain of the generations, as the Torah is placed lovingly onto the altar of history. The goat is the one who is celebrated by Jewish poets and novelists, by visual artists, from Shai Agnon's Fable of the Goat to Marc Chagall's famous paintings to Yehuda Amichai's poetry. The symbol of the goat is forever attached to the identity of the Jewish people. Across the Jewish world, from Morocco to Poland, across the Jewish languages, from Ladino to Yiddish to Hebrew, there are folk songs written about the goat. So for most of us, we live our lives with the simple role of the goat. It's about showing up and doing your best to navigate your way through life and through this weary world. But here we are confronted, and now we are confronted by hatred and violence that our generation has not known. And we have to ask ourselves, when must we be like the Lion of Judah? And when can we return to the role of the goat? When do we travel in packs and prides to protect? And when do we travel in herds to be counted among the greater whole? Each one of us has to ask ourselves this question now, and it's not an easy question. I wish it were otherwise. I really do. But here we are. A crisis has been imposed upon us. An invasion we could not imagine befell us on October 7th. And so now each in our own corner of the world, each in our own way, must vacillate carefully. Sometimes the lion on the lookout, on the march. We do this in our workplaces. We do this in our schools, God help us. We do this in our neighborhoods. We do this on social media. And sometimes we return to the great herds of our people, the great gathering. We just show up to be counted in our synagogues. We show up to be counted at rallies. We show up to add our prayers to the prayers of our people so that they can grow in magnitude and they can grow in power. I'd like to conclude with the last lines from a Hebrew poem written by Natan Alterman. It's one of my favorite Chad Gadya poems. He writes, the very same storytelling then silently said, "Okay, kid, stand there. In my pages there are smoke and blood walking. I am talking of greatness and secrets. Yet I know that the sea will part for a reason. There is sense in breaking through the deserts. If at the end of the tale there is a parent and a kid waiting for their turn to shine." So may it be for our families, so may it be for our children, so may it be for each of us. And let us recall God's promise to Isaac in this week's parsha, Al Tira, do not be afraid, God says, for I am with you.